Hey, Chris.
Yeah?
How do you know which exercises to use to improve various movements?
Well,
So, a Russian doctor actually came up with a solution to this. A guy called Dr. Zhevanatsky, or Zefakanatsky, something like that, came up with a 5-list criteria which brings what kind of movements or exercises you should do to accomplish improving your specific primary movement or sport. And this checklist, if you like, is called dynamic correspondence. So what I'm going to do is briefly describe each of the 5 points so you know exactly what coaches look out for when they're choosing what kind of exercises to improve the kind of movements you need to do in your sport or general activity. Number 1, the amplitude and direction of movement. So this basically describes if the exercise represents the same sort of movement and going in the same sort of direction as those kind of sport or movement that you do in your sport. This point also describes or explains whether the movement you're doing in the gym or an exercise is in the right plane of movement compared to the sport that you're trying to do. For example, is your sport a twisting motion? Is it a forward motion? Or is it a side-to-side motion? So, to put this into context, you could use Olympic weightlifting to improve the performance of a high jumper because that direction of movement is upwards. They're achieving triple extension in both of their movements. So an Olympic weightlifting movement, such as a clean or a snatch, will be good for people trying to develop their jumps, whether it be a high jumper or any other sport that requires jumping. And for another example, for someone who's playing golf, that's obviously a very twisting movement, so you could use exercises like a cable row or pull-off press to improve the performance of your transverse plane performance. Number 2, the extenuated region of force production. So basically, this describes or explains where in the movement in the sport is force most needed. So if you take a tennis player, for example, the last bit of their forehand swing is actually when most force is required. So 2 exercises which you can compare is something like a cable twist or cable turn, whatever it's called, and a med ball slam or med ball toss. Now both are working that twisting plane forces. However, one, the cable, is consistent in producing force basically the same throughout the whole movement, whereas the med ball toss is far more explosive at the final part of the twist. So it would be more appropriate to use a med ball toss compared to a cable axe chop, that's the word I'm looking for, axe chop, to really develop a tennis player's transverse plane force. Number 3, the dynamics of effort. So this explains whether the exercises you choose to develop your sport need to be fast and explosive or slow and steady. So if we take an Olympic weightlifter, for example, the final part of their pull is very explosive. So you need to choose exercises which are explosive to develop that part of that performance. To the contrary, someone like a swimmer or a rower doesn't need to be that explosive all the time. It needs to be more steady in the contraction. So exercises which are less explosive will be better for them to develop that part of their performance. Side note, sometimes it is very important to use different types of contractions to improve the various sports. So at some points during a swimmer, being more explosive will be helpful. It just depends on what part of the performance you're trying to improve. Number 4, the rate and time of maximal force production. So every sport will require a certain amount of force to achieve the movement you're trying to achieve in that sport. I hope that makes sense. However, some sports or some movements within the sport require you to produce force more quickly to make sure that movement or part of that sports performance is successful. So if you take a runner or a sprinter, each stride, their foot is on the floor for about 0.2 seconds. So basically they need to produce as much force as they can within that 0.2 seconds to propel them forward. So when we're trying to choose exercises, we need to choose exercises which improve, or at least challenge, something called your rate of force development. Generally speaking, it's always better to be stronger and also have a greater amount or rate of force development. That basically means that you can apply more of your strength in a shorter amount of time. So if you've got a running type of sport or a jumping type of sport or a throwing type of sport, if you can produce more force in a short amount of time, you'll be able to produce more force in that short amount of time that it takes for a ball to be thrown, or a puck to be hit, or a ball to be kicked. And number 5, the regime of muscular work. There are 3 types of contraction: eccentric, which is the lengthening of muscle mass; concentric, which is the shortening of muscle mass; and isometric, which is basically tension with no movement in the muscle, so stay still. So different sports have different regimes of muscular work. So what do I mean by that? So the regime of muscular work is basically whether the contraction needed is eccentric, concentric, isometric, or combinations of all of those put together. So if we take something like running, for example, that's cycler, which basically means you have the combination of eccentric and concentric continuously going round and round and round. Whereas if you have something like a power clean, or part of the Olympic weightlifting movements, like a power clean or a clean, you'll find that that is simply concentric because you're pulling straight from the floor. Of course, within each and every sport, they have different regimes of muscular work depending on what kind of movement you're trying to do within the sport. That is why, when you're coaching these sports, you don't coach the whole sport altogether, but you actually try and coach little parts of the sport and then put it all together for the best performance. And each part of those bits of sport will have their own regimes of muscular work.
So, here I am about to perform a clean. So a clean has various different muscular regimes going on. So here we are, I'm about to start the pull, which is concentric. Then as I pull myself underneath the bar, it's an eccentric movement. Then as I catch it, it's almost an isometric movement, depending on how you catch it. And then you see I drive myself out with a concentric movement.
So there you have it. Dynamic correspondence is basically a way of checklisting what exercises you should use to improve performance. Now, it's very difficult to improve all aspects of the performance all in one go. Of course, it's basically impossible. But what we do as coaches is take parts of the performance, improve each part, and using various points of this dynamic correspondence. So sometimes we want to work on the rate of force development, sometimes we want to work on the amplitude of movement. Depending what we want to improve on and depending what the athlete needs will tell us what we need to bias in our programming. If you have any questions about dynamic correspondence or any of the points I've gone through, then please get in touch and I shall see you very soon.